to another one of these sessions where we are just providing a little bit of further background on the mitigation arrangements for functional skills. And I will just put my camera on so you can hopefully see both, to also monitor the sort of the various questions that I'm sure you will be itching to ask if you haven't already done so. We will be back again next week with our sort of regular monthly webinar. I suspect we will be doing, although we haven't sort of absolutely finalised an agenda for that, I suspect mitigation will be remain the hot topic at that session as well. So obviously that we will be getting towards the end of the formal process at that point, but it's a chance obviously to do those things as well.
Interesting job keeping abreast of it all. Been busy.
It's, yes, I mean, between this and I mean, obviously the focus of this session particularly is looking at functional skills, but we've been doing, and certainly for any colleagues who haven't had a chance to sort of dip into the other sessions that we've been doing, focusing on other qualifications, there are recorded presentations now available for ESOL for both the essential skills Wales, and although the deadline's now gone for essential skills Northern Ireland, there were some further bits and pieces added to that as well. I did a session earlier this afternoon for anyone who missed it, focusing on the arrangements for employability and for the bite-sized maths and English qualifications that are also now in scope as far as mitigation is concerned. And there'll be the usual sort of mixture of FAQs and recorded information that will be going up for those in the next day or so as well. I'm going to stop sharing my camera at this point because I think it always interferes with what we're actually trying to say. Amanda, anything you do put down is we'll try to do is sort of covered in the FAQs. We'll try to obviously make sure that we kind of we're able to sort of give you an answer one way or the other on those. So onwards with this session. Microsite sittingguilds.com/COVID-19, and from there that you can follow a link through to the specific information about functional skills. But don't forget there is also a Maths and English resource hub where we've got kind of normal, if you like, normal in inverted commas information about these questions as well. We've obviously also appreciating that there are questions that are kind of coming to saying that obviously the other sort of main categories of qualifications also likewise have sort of statements where you can kind of go to, and also just to touch on bite-sized Maths and English qualifications, they're covered by the guidance covering vocationally related qualifications, or VRQs and NVQs. So there is a separate section of that COVID-19 page that kind of deals with all of those pieces of all those qualifications. In terms of the process for all of these main categories of qualifications, effectively there are 6 main process, and there are various documents that we have kind of produced. There's usually well, in all cases, there is a sort of broad guidance document. In the case of functional skills, also a recorded presentation, a sort of single slide that kind of runs through and summarises the 6 steps. Then also a letter that we've produced, or rather that's come from our managing director, that can be used to kind of help, particularly with some of those conversations you might be having with learners about this process. Past descriptors, which I think we've mentioned in previous sessions, but worth kind of reiterating, are there to sort of help give you a little bit of more insight into a kind of the notion of minimum competence at each of the levels. We have in the last few days also added some documents covering some descriptor documents covering ICT at level 1 and level 2, which may be helpful for that as well. And then and I was going to say an ever expanding list of FAQs. We have added to the FAQs in the last few days, and actually we've just earlier this afternoon, Amanda and myself were discussing kind of the next iteration of those, which I think will also be kind of arriving in the near future as well. For some reason my slideshow stopped. There we go, back again. Some of the common questions that have kind of cropped up. Session. Keep coming through. There we go. That's better. Hopefully. Back in here now. So again, cover that through the FAQs document. Particularly, what we've tried to sort of say is try and use evidence from before lockdown as your main source of evidence, and really the main reason for that is it's likely to be completed in class under the supervision of the teacher. That's not to say there hasn't been work that's been done since then, and there may be things that you can look at and take into consideration, but I guess there is that slight question mark about whose work was it really, particularly if you haven't seen it there. But again, it's not an absolute thing, and ultimately this is about your professional opinion. It is about you making a judgment in the round based on what's there as a whole. Second point about sort of statements from the tutor. Again, we've kind of, within the guidance, we've given a little bit of a steer around that, in the sense that the professional judgment you arrive at is derived from the evidence that is held within the centre that you've had access to and you've had the ability to review, either as an individual tutor or with relevant heads of department. A detailed statement on its own is not necessarily going to give you sufficient evidence to base a judgment on, but it could be used alongside some of the other forms of evidence that we have set out in the guidance document. We have, within that document, tried not to be we've tried not to be too prescriptive. There's always a delicate balance to strike there, in that we wanted to obviously kind of surmise the various things that you could potentially take into consideration, but of course there will always be sort of circumstances that will to some extent indicate how much you can rely on particular forms of evidence, and how much you might want to look for other things to reinforce your judgment. And that's why that list is quite a long list of different things you can take into consideration. But I think that there is that thing about kind of a statement on its own is not sufficient. It would need to be backed up with at least some form of substantive evidence of some sort. If we go on to that third question, what can we do if our learners have sat sample papers? We've got the marks but not the actual papers themselves. We've now added, I think it's question 10 within the FAQs, a kind of a bit of a clarification that you can use kind of records and mark books to track individual learners' progress. So yeah, if you haven't physically got your hands on the actual sample paper they sat, that in itself isn't an issue. You can rely on a record of that test having happened and the outcome of that. Question 4. Do I have to enter a grade for all 3 components of English? Question 45 within the FAQs kind of deals with that. I mean, each of the 3 components of English are treated separately. So obviously there is a decision having to be arrived at. Well, a decision at 2 levels. One, was it your intention in the first place that they would do complete that component during this period, in which case they're in scope. But there's also about whether they go forward. Now for entry level, you only, in terms of the actual submitting the CAG proposals to us, the actual grades to us, it's only passes that need to be submitted. You'll need to, as far as the declaration is concerned, keep a record of the numbers of learners for whom you are deducing they wouldn't have been successful, but you only actually have to submit the passes to us. And the same's also true of speaking, listening and communicating, or communication in the case of legacy at level 1 and level 2. Again, normal run of things, you would only be claiming passes, you wouldn't be claiming fails. So for this process, likewise, you're only submitting for a pass. However, for reading and writing, because they're externally marked by us normally, you would be submitting, or you would, as part of, if they're going forward as part of this process, you need to enter both the learners that you deduce would have passed, but also the learners that you're deducing would have not passed. So the fail grades also need to be submitted. Question 5, just to roll on from that, if we as a tutor have other evidence but not evidence of their work, because they take their work home with them, or no way of getting it, does that have to be treated as a fail? And I guess it's a similar point really to question 3, in the sense of if you've got mark books and other records that you can draw upon, then they are things that you can work through. It's only really if you've got nothing substantial, nothing tangible to go on, that you're in the territory where you may need to consider this as a no submission. And those may be the situations where if you really haven't got enough to make a sound decision, there may well be a situation where you may need to consider going back to doing the actual assessments when delivery returns to normal once this immediate process is over. Question 6, are we still able to claim a pass based on work done since the close down only? Again, we've added within the FAQs, it's now I think question 21, evidence does need to be valid, and again, it's I think similar to the point we were making earlier on, in the sense that the reason why we're kind of trying to sort of steer you towards looking at evidence from before lockdown is that notion that it's going to be generally more likely to have happened in a face-to-face environment. And again, it is about you using your judgment there. I appreciate there will be some situations where you've literally got work done since March is all you've got to go on, and that's not to say you can't use that and take that into consideration and use those. And then the final sort of question in this kind of group of kind of, or within this sort of broad theme, is can learners still take an assessment or an exam in the normal way? Now, as things stand, the formal position is no, because the presumption behind this process was that every learner due to be assessed during this period would go through the calculated result process. Now, our presumption is that we will resume kind of exams and assessments in the normal way once this process has been completed. Certainly from August onwards, we would envisage exams starting to happen as normal. Amanda, can you see any other sort of questions kind of coming through on this sort of broad theme that we haven't already touched upon? I could see the question sort of box flashing quite a lot to see there were a few things coming through. I think you may.
What they need to do about reading, writing and maths. It's important to understand that ICT is part of this process as well. So you need to gather evidence about the learners' progress on their course, and make a judgment about submitting centre assessed grades in just the same way for ICT as you do for maths and English. There are quite a lot of questions about the submission process that I'm not going to be able to answer here, because they're to do with actually the tool itself. So I'm going to take those away, and I will email people who've asked questions. I will email their response directly. Seeing that process, we have a different team who are in charge of the quality for that. So EQAs will continue to do their submissions for entry level and speaking and listening and communicating. So at the moment, obviously, people are not able to visit sites. So where it's feasible for you to set up a remote monitoring visit, that can be arranged with your quality team, particularly if you don't yet have direct claims for a qualification, but you do need to make some claims.
Yeah, probably also, I was just going to say, it's probably also worth saying on that point that, and I know this has come up in some of the other sort of discussions I've had in the last few days, is that where a centre hasn't got direct claims status at the moment for functional skills, they're still able to make centre assessment grade proposals. And in a way, I think as Amanda was saying, the normal sort of EQA monitoring activity sits entirely separate. This is very much a self-contained one-off process where we are asking you to, and it's one of the reasons why we're asking you to submit everything in one hit, if you like, so we can look at everything you've put forward in one go. Our quality team will sort of manage all of that centrally. They will review obviously what you've put forward, assuming that we're happy, and we're happy to sort of can go along with what you've proposed. You'll then expect to kind of get your results kind of issued at the end of July, and there is a sort of, if you like, and that's one of the reasons why there's kind of like a single day when all of the results will come out, just so this is very much a clear and self-contained process. But obviously EQAs are involved as normal for any activity that happened or will happen kind of outside of this process. It's just they won't be directly looking at what you've put forward for this, and which is another reason, I guess, for saying that you're it's one of the reasons why we're asking your head of centre to ultimately to be the person who signs this off. So there is a very clear kind of internal process of managing what goes forward under this process.
I've had a query from Karen about entry-level qualifications and what should be claimed. So for entry-level, maths and English, and for speaking and listening, you would only be submitting passes. So looking at the centre assessed grades and submitting those candidates who you think have passed in the same way as you would only claim a pass. For entry level, you wouldn't usually tell us if a learner had failed. For reading, writing and maths at level 1 and level 2, which is an externally marked component, you do need to give us both passes and fails for those. Coming back to your evidence questions, so Ella says she only has post 20th of March evidence because of the way they've been teaching, and she also says that the evidence is locked away in a building, so it's not feasible for you to make a judgment without having something to refer to. So if you have, as Paul said earlier, some tracking or some mark books that allows you to make a judgment about a learner's process, that in itself is sufficient evidence, but you have to be able to review the evidence. So if it's not there because you can't access it, then it won't be possible to make a claim on that basis. And somebody else has said, Angela has said, most of her work for apprentices is done remotely and completed independently. Is this okay? I think it's worth you saying something a bit, Paul, about what valid evidence is.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's always a bit of a because in a way it's validity in the, I was going to say validity in the eye of the beholder. That's always a bit of a sort of tricky way of describing it. But I think that in some ways it is always about reviewing what's there and coming to a rounded judgment. I mean, there are, if we put the old NBQ assessor hat on for a moment, there are always judgments to be made about the validity, reliability, and of evidence, and in a way, all of those kind of considerations kind of need to be part of the picture here, in the sense that any piece of evidence is only tells you what it tells you in essence. So there is that sort of point in the sense of looking at what you've got, what you're able to access, and I guess, as Amanda said, there may be situations where you've literally nothing that you can meaningfully look at and review, in which case you may well need to be kind of in a situation where you're not putting something forward under this process. But assuming you've got something to go on, it's really about reviewing that evidence. I guess that leads to another point that I know has come up in some of the conversations I've been involved in the last few days, where I think it's also important to have in mind that this process runs, although the submission window closes next week, the process itself actually is ostensibly to cover any assessment activity that was due to happen between the 20th of March and the 31st of July. So actually what you're trying to do through this process, and I appreciate it's a bit of an inexact science, but what we're ultimately trying to arrive at is an assumption about whether learners, by the time they get to the 31st of July, would they have achieved the components that they were going forward for assessment in. So it's not just simply a case of looking at where learners are right now, it's actually really trying to think about where they would have been in 6 weeks' time, so where they would have been at the end of July. And the reason why that's significant is you could well have a situation where you might have assumed that they were going to do their exams in April. They will have got their results probably towards the latter point of May, and you may well have had another opportunity to put them forward. So you may well want to factor in the potential for them to have had another go at the assessments in the meantime. You may want to factor in further teaching that could have taken place during this period. So it is about trying to, and again, this is always about you making a professional judgment in the end and using evidence to support that judgment. So it's not just simply about what mark they got in their mock. It's about using all of those things that you can put your hands on to basically make a reasoned judgment about whether it's fair to assume they would have passed by the time they get on or before the 31st of July, and putting that forward as your submission. Okay, probably a good moment, unless there are any other sort of questions that are sort of flowing in that kind of along this same sort of theme, or shall I move on to?
Move on, and
because I know one of the other,
trying to keep up with the questions.
Sure, yeah, appreciate it. I know one of the other real hot topics has been, and I guess we've touched upon it already, but I might touch on it a little bit more, which was particularly around speaking, listening and communicating, because I guess that tends to be the one where there are lots of judgments to make that aren't necessarily physical product evidence. So that kind of comes up as well. So I'll perhaps roll on to that in terms of some of the common questions that have come through on some of these. So we've got, I think this has been sort of quite a common topic, which is around, and it's not strictly confined to speaking, listening and communicating, but I guess it's the area where it kind of particularly comes up, which is really about where learners are doing other vocational qualifications, which most of which in reality do tend to involve having to write things, read things and discuss things. And there is I guess a question here about can you take those into consideration, and can you draw on those when you're making decisions about putting forward for this, and can the evidence from the other qualification or from the other learning be used to kind of show competency? We've had this asked in some cases, particularly in relation to borderline learners, and I guess that's partly a consideration, but it is also about can you more broadly take these into consideration as part of your judgment. Now we've tried to sort of, I guess, give a kind of a steer around that in the FAQs. I think it's particularly question 18, and I guess the crucial point there is that it is about using those insights, or using that evidence to inform those professional judgments. So it is about that perhaps sometimes having to, as well as looking at those outputs for hot taps, also relying on the insights of the teacher or the tutor that set it or marked that particular piece of work to help inform that judgment. So I know we've had a few questions where we've just said, well, they've done a unit that involved some writing within their vocational qualification. Can I just take it as read that they would have passed reading or in this case speaking, listening and communicating on the back of that? And I think the answer is you need a little bit more than that, in that you need the judgments of the person who taught the learners that, in the sense that you've got to be able to really infer from what was there that they would have demonstrated some of those competencies. And again, it's not about necessarily having everything in place. It's about surmising based on where things would have got to by the end of July that they would have got there, if you wanted to put them forward for a pass. Probably a similar story here also, and again this has come up quite a lot as a question, and that's around past descriptors for speaking and listening. And I guess the answer is there aren't any, and really the point around past descriptors were more about the externally set and marked components, where there is a kind of a notion of a minimum level of competence. If you think about the way that speaking and listening normally operates, you've got those subject content statements that need to be met at each level, and there isn't if you like, the pass mark for that. There isn't a pass mark as such. You've got to be able to evidence all of those. So the same is true in terms of the presumption for this, in that you've got to have a way of being able to make you've got to be, find my words, you've got to be able to surmise for all of those points in the end. And there isn't a sort of, if you like, there isn't a pass mark for those in the way that there is for externally marked components. I think we are, and I mentioned earlier on, we are working on the sort of next incarnation of the FAQ. So I think there is a plan to sort of try and give you a little bit further guidance around how you might draw on those. But clearly, the subject content statements are the things that really should be informing your judgments. And again, it is about judging where learners would have been, not where they are at the moment. So it is obviously trying to sort of use those to inform your judgments. Third question, I guess this is on a little bit of a similar theme, which is, do tutors still need to complete the speaking, listening, communication documentation for these learners as if they would do normally? And the answer there is not if they're going through this process. You may well want to create, and certainly I've seen people planning to do this, where they've sort of created a kind of a witness statement or similar to sort of outline what they've the evidence that they've based their judgments upon and why they think the learner would pass. And again, I think that's one of the things that we've got in mind to go into the next version of the FAQs when that's updated over the next day or so. But yeah, no, you're not having to fill out the forms in the way you would normally do. If you have done, then yeah, that can help inform the judgments, but you're not having to. I mean, I've also seen questions in the last couple of days about, do I have to get signatures from the candidates? And the answer again is no. And I guess obviously in purely practical terms, you may not actually be possible to do that, but it is about you having something on which you can make that reasoned judgment that they would have passed. We've got fourth question, which is kind of on a sort of slightly related theme, which is if the learner had completed their speaking, listening, communicating assessment in the normal way, and if that's gone through IQA, can that be claimed? And the answer to that, again, I think we have alluded to that in the FAQs already. So question 32 covers that. So if it's happened. I mean, I know we issued some guidance at the end of March about allowing that to happen remotely, but if that's happened, if all of the requirements have been met, you've completed all the paperwork in the normal way, and you've gone through your IQA process, then you can submit a claim for those in the normal way. The thing that you do need to be clear about, and there's a bit of care maybe taken here, is that you don't try and double claim here, in the sense that don't claim in the normal way and include this as part of your centre assessment grade submission. That might cause some practical issues in terms of our systems and processing that information if we're trying to sort of put that result through twice. But if you've done it as normal and you're able to claim it as normal, you can still go ahead and do that. What we are generally saying, though, is that learners, as part of this process, if you haven't got an absolutely completed assessment to submit, the centre assessment grade process is a mechanism by which you can enable them to achieve the component before the end of July. And then the final question is, can we use evidence from a previous level? And I guess the answer is, I mean, I guess the stock answer to that is any evidence potentially can be used. It's really about using it to show to support your judgments. It will if it only shows partial progress, you might need to support it with something else. And in the end, it is actually your professional judgment that comes first. If it provides some context, then absolutely fine, that's fine. And again, I think we are planning to put something along those lines in the next version of the FAQs to kind of perhaps flesh that point out a bit more. Amanda, any more sort of things coming through on the other questions? I think you're still on mute again.
Sorry, I was on mute again. Yes, somebody's asked a question about only having evidence after lockdown the 20th of March. Can that be used if that's all they've got?
And if it's all you've got, then it's all, yes, it's about making, and it's similar to the points we were making earlier on, in the sense that it is about reviewing what evidence you have got available and making a judgment on the back of that, in the sense, I guess there's some broad assumptions that kind of lay behind this, in the sense that there was a kind of preference for using evidence from before lockdown, and that was really just simply about it being a little bit more comfort about its reliability. But I appreciate there will be situations where learners only started since lockdown, and actually all of the substantive work that they've done with you may well be since then, in which case again, they're still formally in scope as far as this process is concerned, and their work, if that's stuff that you can look at, and if you've got a kind of level of comfort, for want of a better way of describing it, on which you can use that to make a judgment that you feel comfortable about putting forward, and that you've kind of got that sense is a fair judgment to make, then I mean, I think we've never said you can't use it. What we've said is try not to rely solely on it.
Okay, thank you. So somebody raised the question about the closing date for this submission process being the 26th of June, and at the moment exams are not due to be available until the 1st of August. So what about those learners in July? It's probably worth being really clear about this, that this process is designed that you look at the learners who were due to complete between the 20th of March and the 31st of July. So you've got to take into account, when you submit your grades, although we're asking for you to submit those grades by the 26th of June, you would take into account those learners who were due to take their assessment in July. So there will be a little bit of thinking about, maybe there are elements of the course that you haven't yet delivered. So you will then have to use the evidence that you've built up on their journey so far to make a judgment about whether, in your opinion, they would have passed the whole qualification. Is there anything you want to add to that, Paul?
I think that's quite an important point, and I think it is one that is important to keep in the mind all the way through. And I touched on that a little bit earlier on when I talked about, in a way, what you've almost got to do is put yourself in the shoes of yourself in 6 weeks' time, in terms of, could you at that point have deduced, and you've kind of almost got to take into account any learning that might have happened in that in those, or any assessments that could have potentially taken place in the intervening the next month, or actually the next 5.5 weeks, and make a judgment about where would learners have been at that point, if normality had been continued during that period, and can you and in the end, can you justify putting forward a submission that they would have passed if they had gone forward for assessment during that period?
I think some people are asking questions that show they're a little they're not confident about the type of evidence for speaking and listening, or speaking, listening and communicating, and how this is written down. I think what's probably good practice is to look at the assessment criteria for the legacy, or the subject content statements for the reformed qualification, and look at them individually and consider the learner's performance against each of those in turn, and think about where you're drawing your evidence from. There have been questions about whether people need to complete the speaking and listening paperwork, the assessor records, and we're certainly not looking for centres to do that. But I've heard a number of good practice cases where people have used those assessor records and actually adapted them, so taken the boxes out of the form and deleted sort of the information about who's signing where, and they've created a bullet point list of the types of examples of activities where they know that learner has done some speaking, listening and communicating, and then they've used the subject content statements in turn to reflect on their performance. So it's not a formal speaking and listening assessment, but it certainly allows you to make a judgment for that individual learner.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think the crucial difference is that if you were doing speaking, listening and communicating, if you're doing that discussion activity and that presentation activity, and then that sort of if you like, that third activity where there's questioning and answering, it's happening on an occasion, you're observing it as an assessor and you're seeing it happen. What we're trying to do with this process, I guess, is surmising would learners have met each of those subject content statements, and I guess if you've got instances that you can recall or see that reinforce that, then it's good to have some mechanism by which you're able to sort of reference your judgments back to those content statements, because again, in the end, those are the assessment criteria on which the qualification is based. Obviously, the skill standards likewise would be the case for the legacy qualification. So it is about obviously using those. In a way, you are using the standards to inform your judgments, but it is also obviously about trying to use the insights, and I guess particularly with speaking and listening, because there isn't necessarily product evidence unless you've got recordings of discussions that might have taken place earlier on. You haven't got kind of physical product evidence in the way that you might have for writing, where you've got maybe pieces of writing that you can look at and make a judgment about. It's tending to be stuff that you've seen, and that's really where the idea of having things like witness statements and so on can kind of help provide that kind of reinforcement about the kind of the conclusions that you've come to from that.
There are a couple of questions about when learners can take tests in a conventional way or resit where they have not been successful. Currently, we're saying that tests are only available from the 1st of August. So that's the booking on Walled Garden and for both online or on screen and paper-based tests will be opened again from the 1st of August.
Yeah.
Trawling through.
Probably just thinking on that point, it's probably worth saying that you can still submit results for entry level and for speaking and listening if they've been done in the normal way. I mean, obviously the presumption with this process was that everybody due for assessment during this period goes through calculated results, but appreciate in practice there may well be assessments that took place earlier, or there may be activities that have happened where IQA activity hadn't happened in the meantime. If they're outside of this process, they can still be we can still accept claims for them in the normal way. What is important to keep in mind though is that what you shouldn't be doing is submitting any calculated or any centre assessment grades through the normal Walled Garden results submission process. If you're submitting a centre assessment grade under this process, there is a specific centre assessment grade tool within the Walled Garden that you would use to upload this, and that's why there's a deadline at the end of next week for submitting under that process. And obviously there's the requirement to fill the form, to complete the declaration form that goes with that. So it's important not to confuse the two, but if you've got assessments that have happened in the normal way for speaking, listening, and I guess entry level likewise, they can still be claimed in the normal way if they have gone through that process as normal.
So here's an interesting question. What happens if a candidate's tutor has left the provider or the college or the training provider? Can other staff make the grading decision after reviewing the evidence?
I guess it comes down to if they're able to do so, then there's no, it may depend a little bit in practice as to what records might have been left by the member of staff that has left, in the sense of if you've got information that you can look at and you can draw upon and you can use that to make that judgment, then the fact there's been a change of staff shouldn't in itself be a reason not to allow it to go forward. I guess it's really about the level of confidence you've got in that information.
There's a number of questions about centres where they have done assessing of speaking, listening and communicating either remotely presumably or just before lockdown really kicked in, but that they haven't been IQA'd and they want to know whether they can follow the normal IQA process and claim the units. My understanding was that you would have to use that evidence to make a centre assessed grade, but that's something that I will check to make sure that I'm not just misunderstood that. The idea is that at the moment we're not doing any assessments, live assessments for functional skills, and that centre assessed grades are the way forward. So if you have the evidence from those activities, those remote speaking, listening, that evidence can be used to make your judgment, but that actually it shouldn't be claimed through the conventional route. But I will need to check that. I think Joe and Paul have both asked that question, so I'll get back to them.
Yeah. I mean, it's come up a little bit in the sense that there will be instances where you've already done IQA activity, in which case I think, and as I said, obviously you can still in practice submit a claim. It's really just about if you haven't gone through that process. I mean, one of the advantages of the centre assessment grading process is it doesn't necessarily expect you to have 100% coverage in quite the normal way, in the sense that you're putting forward an estimation as to whether they would have passed. And obviously if you've got evidence from an actual assessment that took place, then clearly that informs that judgment, but it gives you a little bit of wiggle room if there were any gaps, and particularly if you were trying to do this under lockdown, and you may have created a situation where it wasn't quite as straightforward as it would have normally been, and it gives you arguably it gives you that little bit of extra comfort in terms of being able to make that or being able to surmise that in normal circumstances it would have resulted in a pass. So yeah, I mean the presumption at the moment, as Amanda said, is that anybody going forward for assessment during this sort of period between March and the end of July should be going through calculated results. But if you've got assessments that have already happened and you've got all of the quality assurance has already happened, then we're not preventing you from submitting those. It's just really about whether it might be better in the circumstances to treat that as a calculated result.
And the other thing to remember is if you did submit a claim, that wouldn't pull through to the centre assessed grade. So that learner would appear on that list for a centre assessed grade, and you need to be very careful that they are not dual claimed, so that you don't put two claims in for that one unit. I take on board what Jackie says. Jackie says it's very confusing. Yes, I agree, and I do apologise if you feel we haven't really been very clear. The goalposts have changed. They've moved quite continuously, I would say, over the last 2 weeks. So it does feel as if sometimes we say something 1 week and then we just give you a slightly different story the second week, and we're trying really hard to keep you abreast of what's being asked of us as an organisation. One just here about English submissions and claiming. If this is a legacy qualification for English, once you've gone through the centre assessed grades process and you have the results on the 31st of July, you will then need to submit a certification code to zip those 3 elements up and get the certificate. For the reformed 4748 qualification, the system recognises that has happened, and you should get then full certification for the English once those results have been issued.
No, thanks. I think that's the point. And again, I think just to reiterate the point, some of these things have been a moving feast over the last sort of couple of weeks. So they have, even when we've thought they've been clear, other things have emerged that have perhaps brought things into question as well. And particularly that whole piece around how much or actual assessments might have continued to happen under lockdown. I think the government's assumption when they framed this guidance was that everybody started last September, all delivery continued until March, and everything came to a shuddering halt in March, and nothing much happened since. And in that sense, that quite simplistic assumption was what framed the original sort of guidance around this. And I think we know, and everybody probably on this call kind of recognises that in reality, lots of people are in much more nuanced situations than that. There will have been things that have taken place since the 20th of March that could help be useful in terms of informing those judgments, and I think there is a general acceptance that those can be used. There were assessments that took place after the 20th of March that, again, if those happened and they happened under all of the required conditions, then again we wouldn't take those away from anybody, and they can continue to go forward. But what this process does allow is for you to make some assumptions about any learners who would have gone forward for assessment. For whatever reason you're not able to do so, or actually to some extent it's prevented, or it's created a situation where you don't need to go through that normal process of assessment, and it allows obviously candidates that are in this situation to have a result that's determined through this estimation process instead. I mean, obviously the outcome, as far as they are concerned, in the end they'll receive the same certificate as any other candidate. So the qualification that they receive, the only thing that will perhaps identify them as having gone through this process is the date on their certificate, because obviously all results going through this process will be issued on the 31st of July this year, but the actual qualification itself will be the same as any other learner that did the qualification before then, or indeed after then, when the sort of normal process of assessment resumes.
So there are a couple. Oh dear, the system scrolled past somebody's question that I was going to ask. Oh, how many times would you expect a learner to hit a content statement? I like to go back to Paul's description of this qualification as being a mostery. So if where you've seen evidence that a learner has understood a subject content statement, then I think that's evidence that they understood it on that occasion. So we aren't sort of totting up a list of how many times they can do it, particularly not in this situation where we're making a judgment about a whole qualification where you may not have delivered certain elements of it. And then I've got a lovely comment here from somebody who says, why does the list of claims have to be made by the 26th of June rather than 26th of July? When you consider that we will have to look at every single one of those submissions made on the 26th of July, or June rather, of all the centres that we have, and it will have to go through our quality assurance processes and then get the exam results out by the 31st of July. And that's a date that's been agreed broadly across all awarding organisations, and it relates to the technical process, the technical qualifications. It just wouldn't have been possible for us to, it won't be possible for us to do that if we made the closing date of submissions any closer to the 31st of July, sadly. And I would say our window for submissions has been open, it will be open for longer than some of our competitors. We have pushed it back as far as we can.
Yeah. And again, it is because obviously we were asking you to make a judgment based on where learners would have been at the end of July. It is about you obviously trying to use, and again, in all of these cases, we're not expecting absolute 100% coverage of everything. It is about you having enough to be able to, and actually in the end, it is about trusting your own instincts as a professional to be able to have enough to support those judgments and put something forward. And again, it's having in mind that extra month that you might have had for teaching, learning and assessment had this process not been there. And so it is about, even though you're having to make the submission by the end of next week, you're perhaps taking into account activity that may well have been due to happen after that, and you're using that to inform your judgments as well as what you've already seen.
Yes, I just wanted to be quite clear, because we've had a couple of questions in the question box. We talked about how the EQAs, so the City and Guilds external quality assurers who come out and do your monitoring visits, they are not part of this process. this centre assessed grades process and actually haven't been involved in the decision making or the connotations of the system. So I must reiterate, if you have queries about this system, or that for some reason you feel you want more clarity about a piece of evidence that you have, we have an email address that you can contact with your questions, which is estimation.quality@cityandguilds.com, and I would encourage you to direct your queries to that central point. We have a team of people who are monitoring that and feeding back responses to people, rather than approaching your EQAs, because they won't necessarily have the answer to this. So we're trying to save them from this. And there's a centre here that says that they have vast numbers of people and they're really going to struggle with the submission process. And again, I don't know that there is any deadline movement on that deadline, but you could contact that email address and put forward your case to see whether there is any movement that could be applied.
Again, that was something that, because this process obviously is common to all awarding organisations and a lot of the regulatory conditions, and obviously it is very much a regulatory process, were not wholly within our gift. I mean, I think what we've tried to build into this process, as Amanda said a second ago, is as much wiggle room as we could in terms of making the submission deadline as late as we feasibly could. I mean, it gives us 5 weeks in essence from the end of next week until the 31st of July to turn around every result that would have gone forward under this process, or give to consider every result that's been proposed under this process and review it. And our quality team, I think, will be working flat out over the next few weeks to obviously review all of those claims, and obviously vast majority of cases, I'm sure, will agree with what's submitted and issue calculated results accordingly. But obviously, what they are having to do is obviously review and monitor what's gone through that, and that's why we obviously needed to build in enough time to allow that process to happen. I guess it's also worth keeping in mind that this process is only you only need to consider learners who were in scope for this process. So it's only learners for whom you were originally planning for them to complete assessments during this period, and that I guess where there is a time critical need for them to have gone through this process, there may well be situations where learners are still planning, are still going to be on programme after the end of July, and you may well have not planned for them to go forward for assessments, and in which case you pick up as normal after this process has happened, and they wouldn't necessarily need to be in scope for this.
I'm very aware that we're about to run out of time and I don't want us to be cut off suddenly. If you missed that email address, if you visit the COVID-19 web pages on the website, you will see there is the address is given several times on the functional skills page and elsewhere if you want to contact them. And somebody's come back to say they've already been in touch and they found them extremely helpful. So that's always a very positive thing to hear.
Yeah.
So I'm aware that I haven't been able to respond. I've been responding to questions as I've gone. So, but I'm aware that I haven't been able to respond to everybody's questions because there've been hundreds. So again, we take these offline. What we did was after the last one, we updated the FAQs with the questions that we had. I'm hoping to have another update of the FAQs to go up by the end of tomorrow, and in the meantime I'll be looking across all of these questions to see what we can add in. And just to say that the communication regarding the timeline for legacy qualifications was held up, unfortunately. I had hoped that it would go out earlier this week, but it hasn't, but we're hoping that should go out in the next couple of days.
That's just for clarity, is to reiterate, is to indicate when we given that the legacy qualifications last certification has been extended till December, it's just when we plan to start the process of withdrawing those assessments, isn't it? If
Yes.
I understand correctly.
Sorry, that was me talking and reading the question box flowing at the same time. Sorry, everybody. Okay, so thank you very much, Paul, for taking us forward with that. What I will do, if that's all right, we will leave it open for another 5 minutes. So if there are any last minute questions, people can type them in the box.
We will in any event be back next Wednesday, 4 o'clock again, actually, for our regular monthly webinar. So if you have, I guess what we have seen as part of these, as a result of doing these extra sessions, is we have seen quite a few more people sign up for the regular series. So what we normally do at the end of during these monthly sessions is usually pick a topic around the broader world of maths and English and explore it a little bit in a little bit more depth. I guess COVID-19 and the mitigation arrangements have kind of overtaken that in recent weeks, but we do at some point, I'm sure we will start returning to these sessions being kind of what they're normally intended to be, which is around obviously supporting the wider maths and English arena. But I would imagine, yeah, next week's session, probably the dominant theme will continue to be this process. So it is obviously a further opportunity, particularly as will be in the last couple of days before the deadline. Your last sort of, if you like, your last chance to kind of talk through anything you're unsure about or be reassured about anything that you need a little bit more reassurance about before that process comes to a formal close. So we will hopefully see you again next week. As Amanda said, we'll leave the question box open for the next few minutes. So if you haven't already posed a question, or if you're midway through doing so, you've got a chance to do so. But beyond that, we'll say thank you again, and we'll hopefully see you again next week.
Thank you.